Hello everyone and welcome to this tutorial for the AQA Power and Conflict Poetry Cluster. Tutorial 16 is on the Emigree by Carol Rumans. You'll need your AQA anthology and 3 different coloured highlighters. How this tutorial will work, just in case you're new, is you'll watch a video of me annotating the poem in which I narrate over the top of it. We'll then discuss the poem in detail, looking at the story, the message and the themes. And then at the end, I'll pose some questions to you, which I highly recommend you take some time to answer just to ensure you have understood and to solidify your engagement with that poem. So without further ado, it is time to annotate.
I was running from my brother and his friends. Tasted the sweet perfume of the mountain grass I rode down. I was younger then. Take me back to when I found my heart and broke it here. With friends and lust and through the years, I've not seen the roaring fields for so long. I know I've grown. I can't wait to go home. I'm on my way and driving at 90 down those country lanes, singing to Tiny Dancer, and I miss the way you make me feel it's real. We watch the sunset over the castle on the hill. 15 years old and smoking hand-rolled cigarettes, running from the law through the backfields and getting drunk with my friends. And my first kiss on a Friday night, I don't reckon that I did it right. I was younger then. Take me back to when we found weekend jobs. When we got paid, we'd buy cheap spirits and drink them straight. Me and my friends have not thrown up in so long. Oh, how we've grown. I can't wait to go home. I'm on my way and driving at 90 down those country lanes, singing to Tiny Dancer, and I miss the way you make me feel it's real. We watch the sunset over the castle on the hill. I'm on the way. I still remember these old country lights when we did not know the answers, and I miss the way you made me feel it's real. We watch the sunset over the castle on the hill. Clock strikes upon the hour and the sun begins to fade. There's still enough time to figure out how to chase my blues away. Well, I've done alright up to now, but it's the light of day that shows me how. And when the night falls, the loneliness calls. And oh, I wanna dance with somebody. I wanna feel the heat with somebody.
Okay, so first of all, we're going to look at the themes. So the Emigree links to the power of memory, the power of place, the power of cultural identity, and the conflict caused by culture or identity. You'll find that this links quite well to London for Power of Place, to Checking Out Me History, to Poppies or Kamikaze. And you can kind of see where those themes come in when you consider that if you've followed the tutorials in order, you've probably encountered these themes before. So a little bit about Carol Rumens, not much really, but important to know that she was incredibly inspired by her travels. So she was actually born in England, and Emigree is a female who settled in a different country. This is not Carol Rumens, she was born in England. So we have a speaker here that, you know, is just inspired, and so the speaker, we have a poet here, the speaker actually isn't the poet themselves. So we just make a note here. So somebody who's left a country to settle in a different one, and it's a female because of the way that it's spelt. Okay, so the opening, there once was a country. This gives us a sense a little bit like our traditional fairy tales, Once Upon a Time. So this fairy tale opening aids the nostalgic tone, this idea of it being a memory, a distant memory, and also links to a vulnerable child. What you'll see is that this is actually, the speaker is an adult talking about a memory from childhood. So we get the vulnerability that she may have felt when she was a child. It also perhaps suggests that the country she's speaking of has gone and doesn't exist anymore. There once was a country suggests that that country doesn't exist. And that sets a bit of a sense of foreboding about the country. We then have the ellipsis in the middle, and this heightens the sense of longing. And it suggests to us it's as if her life was ruptured. There once was a country, long pause. I left it as a child. It shows this rupture in her life, that she was in this country and then she had to leave it. So the ellipsis heightens that as well. The fact that we have the phrase I left it as a child indicates to us that the voice is an adult. So this would help us understand that this is a memory and not that it's happening as they speak. But my memory of it is sunlight clear. This metaphor shows that her memory is unspoiled and really heightens this idea of her having an idealized version or memory, this idea where we look at our memories with rose-tinted glasses. For it seems I never saw it in that November, which I am told. This shows a lack of power, maybe even a tone of cynicism, as if I don't know because I was just told it. Remember, she was a child, so this again really heightens this sense of memory not always being that reliable. The worst news I receive of it cannot break my original view. This indicates a war-torn or troubled country. The worst news I receive of it. We get this idea that essentially she loves her country, but some bad things were happening there. So we can assume, we can make an assumption. The metaphor here, my original view, the bright filled paperweight. So a paperweight is actually just used to hold paper down. So this metaphor here shows that her memory is strong and clear, and that a love of her home is unwavering, it's immovable. You can't change that about her. She then says, it may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants. This is the reality of her home. It's a dictatorship. And this metaphor of being sick with tyrants, as if dictators are essentially an illness. But that does mean potentially that it's curable. She then says, I am branded by an impression of sunlight. Now, the word branded to mean forever, painful, and obvious, an identity. You can identify from branded cattle who the cattle belongs to. It's quite an interesting verb to have used. The metaphor as a whole, though, suggests that she will forever have a feeling of comfort for her home, that her impression of her home is sunlight clear, this warmth that we get from the sunlight is really interesting. Going back to the word branded as well, considering checking out my history in the final line, where he says about carving his own identity, there's a sense that the speakers in the poem want to really convey how strong the sense of identity is. If you brand cattle, it's where you heat up metal and then put it on their skin. So the fact that she's branded by an impression of sunlight, like I said, makes it as if this is a really clear and obvious. Her feelings make it really obvious how she feels and who she is. So, second stanza then. The white streets of that city, the graceful slopes glow even clearer as time rolls its tanks. So the colour, the white streets, are symbolic of purity and innocence. And again, it's a juxtaposition of it's a contrast of what we would consider a war-torn country to look at. So if we make that assumption that she's had to flee a war-torn country, it suggests that potentially she does have this idealised view. As time rolls its tanks, the personification of time here conveys it as an enemy, as if time's mission is to make her forget that it's destructive, the fact that it rolls its tanks. It's almost like it's ready to attack. And that's quite an interesting thing, to consider time as an enemy. And the frontiers rise between us, close like waves. So remember I said frontiers were borders. So this simile, to be close like waves, it almost shows that there's an inevitability, a lack of control over what happens. You know, these walls, these borders will happen no matter what. And that's sort of giving us insight maybe into what her life is like as an emigre. We then have this figurative imagery, and I put that because it's both metaphor and simile. That child's vocabulary I carried here like a hollow doll opens and spills a grammar. She's talking about the language she speaks, her sort of mother tongue. So her cultural identity is pure and innocent. It's carried like a hollow doll. There's nothing inside the doll. It's just the language itself. There's nothing to it. There's nothing sinister, which I think is quite interesting. This is a lovely image here. Soon I shall have every coloured molecule of it. She sees her language as a chemical reaction, tiny pieces that form her identity. There's a tone of positivity and empowerment about her learning her language. And the use of the molecule is important. That it will take maybe take some time, little bit by little bit. It then says, it may by now be a lie, banned by the state, but I can't get it off my tongue. This is heightening that dictatorship, and it links to the word tyrants in stanza 1. The language being banned by the state suggests almost like a bit of a coup. But I can't get it off my tongue is a metaphor. And it just shows that she has this unwavering identity, that it's not left her. Just because she's left her country doesn't mean it's left her. And then one of my favourite images is It Tastes of Sunlight. This is synesthesia, which is where you cross over your senses. So you can't taste sunlight, you can feel sunlight, or see sunlight. So this shows us that her identity or memory is tangible within her senses. She can feel it on lots of different levels, so it's not just one sense. We also need to look here that sunlight has been mentioned again in the last line. This is refrain. And we can see then that the sunlight becomes a symbol of her memory or home. So it's mentioned again almost to reinforce that. And you'll see in the last stanza, it's repeated again. Always in different contexts, but always the same. And into the final stanza then. I have no passport, there's no way back at all. There's this sense of being trapped or being an outcast. So she can't be in her own country. But my city comes to me in its own white plane. This personification here shows the physical distance that her city would have to get on a plane to come and see her. She's moved far away. It lies down in front of me, docile as paper. Docile as paper shows that the city's not a threat, but also the fact that it lies down in front of her. It's like a pet. It's defenseless or potentially misunderstood. I comb its hair and love its shining eyes shows the intimate and loving relationship with her home and her identity. There's a closeness, an affectionate way of thinking about her city. Then this final piece of personification, my city takes me dancing through the city of walls. So her new city she refers to as the city of walls. So her city and her memory of it and her identity gives her a sense of freedom in an enclosed place. Memory and culture are important, essentially, because obviously her city doesn't take her dancing, but that's how it makes her feel to remember it, to think about it. We then get a real tonal shift here. They accuse me of absence, they circle me, they accuse me of being dark in their free city. We also get they mutter death. The repetition of they gives us this sense of us and them, which we've seen in Checking Out Me History before as well. This idea that she's an outcast, this is her reality. And it's ironic because we get a sense that she feels unsafe. And that's irony because she's potentially fled a war zone to live in a safer place, but she feels unsafe in her new home because of who she is and what her identity is. And that's really interesting. We then get another piece of personification. My city hides behind me. The personification here shows that there's a need to protect identity, to defend and fight for it. And also shows us that identity, although powerful, is fragile. If the city's hiding behind her, it's to let her take control. So someone offends your country doesn't stand up for itself, you stand up for your country. So it shows that something really powerful is actually also fragile. And then this final line, and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. This is a metaphor that suggests to us in order to have such a strong identity, you have to accept the bad too. Shadows represent darkness, but essentially what she's saying here is that if you have a shadow, that's evidence that the sun is out. If you don't have a shadow, the sun's not out. So in order to be able to have a strong sense of identity, which is represented by the sunlight, you have to accept the bad things too. So that changes there, which is quite interesting. I do have some things to write at the bottom, so hopefully you have got some space. Okay, so we're just looking at that star here. What we have is a list of personification about the city, and all of the things that her city does or represents, and this links with the opening fairy tale in the sense that it's as if she has this idealized version. It's not reality. Her city doesn't take her dancing. It doesn't fly over in its own white plane. She doesn't comb its hair. That's not real, is it? So because she's personifying the city in this way, she's created this fantasied view to protect her identity. It's as if by turning it into this character, she is reinforcing, not to herself necessarily, but potentially, this sense that the city is a good guy, is a hero, not a villain. Whereas I think, if we understand somebody who's left their country to stay somewhere else, and potentially on the news you're hearing all the bad things that are happening, it would be really difficult to stay positive about your country. I also want to talk about the punctuation because I did mark that out but didn't say anything about it throughout. If you notice, the punctuation increases as the poem goes on. So we have the ellipsis at the beginning, but I just really looked at full stops and also semicolons just because they're a longer pause as well. I didn't necessarily look at commas. It's like a physical representation of her feeling trapped, particularly in that last stanza. My city hides behind me, they mutter death, and my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. We get a lot of full stops, almost like walls. It may be symbolic of how much more difficult it is to preserve the idealized version as time goes on. Remember, time is the enemy. So as time goes on, from a child to an adult, it becomes more difficult to have this positive opinion of her country. And then I just want to talk about the refrain of sunlight, which I think is quite interesting. Because you have to think, okay, why always use sunlight? We know that the sunlight has become symbolic of her identity and her home, but why use refrain? So what we could see is that no matter how bad things are, her memory of home and identity will always remain. So the first lines in that stanza potentially discuss bad things or how time is going on and changing, but that last line reinforces how she feels about her identity and her home, and therefore the refrain reinforces that that will not go away. So I'm just going to highlight these. Okay, and that is us done. Okay, so hopefully you have a poem that looks a little something like this. It's not a very long poem, but it does have a lot of links to a lot of other poems for different reasons. So let's first take a look at the story. So this story is essentially a speaker who's recounting a memory of her home country, or home city, and essentially this place she left as a child. And she discusses what she remembers about it. She implies, in some sense, with line 7, it may be at war, it may be sick with tyrants. We get this idea potentially it's a war torn country, or, she's had to flee because of the government or regime there. And as we move through, the speaker discusses her identity in the second stanza, this idea of her language and the way she speaks, and then in the final stanza we get a sense of we get to see how the speaker feels about her city, and we get this presentation of a city that completely juxtaposes line 7 in stanza 1, because this city is docile and it has shining eyes and it takes her dancing. And we get this really fairy tale like view, this beautiful, perfect view of this city that she can't return to because she has no passport and there's no way back at all. She's really trapped. Probably for her own good, but that doesn't stop it. And I think we get a real understanding, if we don't have one, a personal connection to leaving a country that we didn't want to leave. We get a real sense of what it must feel like for immigrants, for example, and asylum seekers, to have to leave a country that potentially they once knew as being wonderful. What we also get a sense of, which I think is quite interesting, is this power of memory, but also the fact that memory can be unreliable. Um, I wrote that there's a nostalgic tone with the there was once was a country, but I also said that quite often you get this idealized version of something, because when we remember, we tend to look at something with rose tinted glasses. And if you haven't heard that phrase before, it essentially means to look back and not see any of the negatives, even if there were some. So this speaker, her memory as an adult of when she was a child and her memory of her home is completely perfect. She actually says that it may be sick with tyrants, which suggests that it just got ill, it just got sick, and not that it became a bad place. And so potentially she looks at it with her child eyes, which children would have a lack of understanding of what was going on. And so she is absolutely unwavering in how she feels about her home. Because of it being home, and because we get a sense of cultural identity when she talks about her language, we get a sense of the power of place as well, because obviously her city means so much to her. But we get this real sense that she is an outcast now as an adult, and that her memory and love for her country is essentially her identity, her cultural identity is where she is from. And so actually you get this real intertwining of these themes as they all kind of reinforce each other and link to each other, which I find quite interesting. I think in terms of a message, I don't see this poem like some of the others where we're learning a lesson or of any sort. I think what we get from this is Ruman's making a statement about memory on the one hand, and this idea that memory is fantastic, it's a wonderful thing, that time does change memory, and time is a bit of an enemy when it comes to memory, because obviously you lose memories, or you don't quite see it as it actually was. Um, And I think that's definitely there, but also just this strong sense of identity, this idea that no matter what, if you can, whatever your view is of your identity and where you came from, that's what's important to you. And that's reinforced with that refrain. I also think the use of the verb branded in the first stanza is really important to this message of identity being out there for everyone to see, that it's not hidden. But again, that the dangers of not hiding your identity in a place where culturally maybe your identity doesn't belong or doesn't feel like it belongs is really difficult. So we get this idea of exile or being outcast, and that actually to be an emigre is no simple thing. But actually, as long as you can stay true in your heart to your home, that your identity will remain, which I think is quite a beautiful message, I suppose, about identity. Okay, to the questions. So, question 1: what technique reinforces that the speaker feels trapped? Question 2: how does Rumans convey that the speaker has a strong sense of identity? Question 3: why does Rumans personify the city? Question 4: what is the effect of the synesthesia used? And question 5: how does Rumans suggest that the speaker's memory is idealized? Take some time now to pause this and answer those questions using your annotations. Thanks very much for watching. I have one more tutorial video left for annotations in this series. So if you have been following along, thank you very much, and I will see you next time for our final poem.